Audie Murphy's name was once synonymous with bravery, honor, and the American dream itself. He was the dirt-poor Texas farm boy who became the most decorated soldier of World War II, then a Hollywood star. But behind the medals, the movie posters, and the public adoration lay a darkness that only grew with time. And when his life ended suddenly in 1971, the explanation seemed simple, until decades later, the truth finally surfaced. And it isn't good. A childhood of hardship. Audie Leon Murphy was born on June 20th, 1925, in Kingston, Texas, into a family drowning in poverty. The seventh of 12 children, he grew up in a small sharecropping household where food was scarce, shoes were a luxury, and survival was never guaranteed. His father, burdened by hardship, abandoned the family, leaving young Audie to shoulder responsibilities no boy should bear. At just 16, his mother died, and with little more than a fifth-grade education, he was forced to drop out of school. Suddenly, he was not just a boy, he was the provider for his siblings, doing whatever work he could find to keep the family alive. These brutal early years shaped him. They forged a toughness, a will to fight, and an instinct for survival that would later define him as both a soldier and a man. He wasn't born into greatness. He clawed his way into it. That hunger, born of starvation, loss, and abandonment, would never leave him. For many, this might have been the end of the story, a forgotten child lost to poverty. But for Audie Murphy, it was just the beginning. By the time he was 17, America was at war, and the boy from Texas was about to rewrite history, the unlikely soldier. In 1942, Audie Murphy was a scrawny teenager, barely scraping by, with dreams of enlisting to escape poverty. But when he tried to join the Marines and Navy, both branches turned him away. He was too short, too thin, too weak, they said. At 5 feet 5 inches and barely 110 pounds, he hardly looked like a warrior destined for history books. But the U.S. Army saw something different. Or maybe they were just desperate. Murphy was accepted into the infantry, and soon the boy from Texas was shipped off to North Africa. His transformation was nothing short of astonishing. What others dismissed as frailty turned out to be something else entirely: agility, endurance, and a fearlessness that stunned even his commanding officers. Murphy's rise was rapid. From Sicily to Italy to France, he carved out a reputation as a soldier who never backed down, no matter the odds. He wasn't the loudest, and he wasn't the biggest, but he was the one you wanted by your side when the bullets started flying. He had the grit of someone who had already survived hell once in his life and wasn't about to bow to it again. By the time the war reached its final year, Murphy wasn't just another soldier. He had become a living legend in the making, one whose acts of courage would soon defy belief. The Day of Valor. On January 26, 1945, in the frozen woods near Holtzwihr, France, Audie Murphy cemented his place in history. The Germans had unleashed a devastating assault, overwhelming Murphy's company and leaving them on the verge of annihilation. Most men would have retreated, surrendered, or simply accepted death. Murphy chose none of those options. Instead, he climbed atop a burning tank destroyer, its flames licking at his boots, and manned its .50 caliber machine gun. For over an hour, he held his ground, mowing down enemy troops, calling in artillery fire, and single-handedly halting an entire company of advancing Germans. Wounded and nearly out of ammunition, he refused to give in until reinforcements arrived. That act earned him the Medal of Honor, the highest military decoration in the United States. But it wasn't just one medal. By the war's end, Murphy had collected every combat award for valor America could bestow, along with decorations from France and Belgium. 33 awards in total. He was just 19 years old. The boy from Texas, once deemed too small to fight, had become the most decorated American soldier of World War II. Newspapers hailed him as a hero. Hollywood soon came calling. And yet, beneath the headlines and parades, the scars of that day, and countless others, would never leave him. Haunted by the war. When Audie Murphy returned home, America saw a smiling young hero. What they didn't see was the torment he carried inside. Today we call it PTSD. Back then it was simply battle fatigue. Murphy couldn't sleep. Nightmares plagued him. Sudden noises made him dive for cover. He slept with a loaded gun under his pillow. Fame didn't soothe his demons, it magnified them. He gambled recklessly, chain-smoked, and depended on sleeping pills. The country that praised him as a symbol of victory offered little understanding of his mental battles. He even spoke out publicly about the emotional toll of combat, a shocking act in an era when soldiers were expected to suffer in silence. Though celebrated, Murphy often admitted that he didn't feel like a hero. He felt broken, and while Hollywood saw in him a star, the man in the mirror still saw the boy from Texas, the orphan, the soldier, the survivor who could never quite escape the battlefield. Hollywood hero. Hollywood rarely ignores a good story, and Audie Murphy's life was more than a story, it was legend. By the late 1940s, he had transitioned from war hero to rising star. His big break came with To Hell and Back, 1955, a film adaptation of his own memoir. In an unusual twist, Murphy played himself, reenacting his wartime experiences for the big screen. The result? One of Universal's highest-grossing films of the decade. Audiences were mesmerized. They weren't just watching an actor, they were watching the man who had lived every frame of the story. And for a time, Murphy seemed poised to rival Hollywood's leading men. He starred in over 40 films, most of them westerns. Titles, like No Name on the Bullet and The Red Badge of Courage, proved he could carry a screen with grit and intensity. But Murphy never saw himself as a true actor. He approached film work with humility, often claiming he lacked the natural charisma of his peers. What he did have was authenticity. When he handled a rifle on screen, you knew he'd handled one in real life. When his eyes flashed with quiet torment, it wasn't an act, it was memory. Hollywood gave him fame, but not stability. The cameras eventually shut off, the scripts dried up, and Murphy was left with the same old demons, only now under the blinding light of celebrity. Turbulent love life. Audie Murphy's personal life was as complicated as his career. In 1949, he married actress Wanda Hendricks, a rising star known for her on-screen charm. But behind closed doors, the marriage quickly unraveled. Murphy's volatile moods, his insomnia, and his ongoing struggles with PTSD placed unbearable strain on their relationship. 2 years later, it ended in divorce. Yet just 4 days after the paperwork was finalized, Murphy remarried, this time to Pamela Archer, a former airline stewardess with no ties to Hollywood. Pamela brought a stabilizing presence, offering the quiet support Murphy desperately needed. Together they had 2 sons, Terry and James, who would carry the Murphy name into the next generation. While the marriage to Pamela lasted until his death, it wasn't without its shadows. Murphy's gambling habits, his unpredictable temper, and his persistent restlessness often tested the relationship. Friends noted that Pamela's loyalty was the glue that held the family together, even as Murphy battled himself. In public, he was the war hero turned movie star. In private, he was still a man at war, this time with his own past. The crash that stunned America. On May 28, 1971, tragedy struck. Murphy boarded a private twin-engine Aero Commander with 4 others bound for Virginia. The weather was bad, low clouds, rain, and poor visibility. Somewhere over Brush Mountain near Catawba, the plane went down, killing everyone on board. News of his death sent shockwaves across the nation. The most decorated soldier of World War II, gone at just 45. Newspapers printed solemn tributes. Flags were lowered. Veterans mourned the loss of a man who had become their symbol. The official explanation seemed straightforward. Pilot error compounded by treacherous weather. A tragic accident, nothing more. But almost immediately, doubts began to surface. Why was the plane flying so low over mountainous terrain? Why did reports of the crash contain odd inconsistencies? Why were certain pieces of wreckage unaccounted for? For most Americans, the story ended at the funeral. But for others, the questions never stopped. What looked like an accident was beginning to look like something else entirely. Whispers of conspiracy. Conspiracy theories often sprout in the shadow of tragedy. But in Audie Murphy's case, the whispers refused to die down. Some claim the crash was no accident. According to these theories, Murphy had enemies, powerful ones. One line of speculation pointed to his involvement in private business dealings, suggesting he may have crossed the wrong people. Another theory tied his death to organized crime, hinting that Murphy owed money from gambling debts. Still others suggested something even darker, that Murphy had stumbled across sensitive information during his Hollywood years, information connected to covert Cold War operations. If true, that made him more than a war hero. It made him a liability. The inconsistencies didn't help. Witnesses recalled strange details. Why the pilot chose such a dangerous flight path, why certain accounts seemed to shift, and why the wreckage didn't quite align with the official story. For years, his family rejected the conspiracy talk, insisting it was a tragic accident. Yet the whispers lingered. Too many unanswered questions. Too many people unwilling to let it rest. If the official story was complete, why did it feel so incomplete? Missing pieces. Investigators in 1971 did their best with the tools they had, but records from the crash were frustratingly vague. Flight logs were incomplete, witness testimony conflicted, and the crash site itself raised eyebrows. Some key fragments of the aircraft were never recovered, or depending on who you asked, quietly removed. Over the decades, researchers picked at these threads. Aviation experts noted that the plane's descent into Brush Mountain didn't fit the standard profile of a weather-related accident. Pilots who studied the case questioned why the aircraft was flying so low at all. Families of the victims, including Murphy's, tried to accept the official verdict, but skeptics argued the evidence was, at best, inconclusive. How could one of America's most decorated soldiers survive dozens of life-or-death battles only to die in a way that felt so avoidable? The answer wouldn't emerge for decades, but when it did, it changed everything. A modern reinvestigation. For years, the mystery of Audie Murphy's death remained buried beneath official reports and unanswered questions. But in recent decades, new tools and new access to once classified documents reopened the case. Independent investigators, armed with advanced forensic analysis and declassified government files, set out to find answers the original inquiry had missed. What they found was disturbing. By re-examining fragments of the wreckage, researchers uncovered signs of tampering. Wiring inside the control system had been altered, cut and rerouted in ways consistent not with malfunction, but with sabotage. Whether it seemed may have been the cover story, not the cause. Interviews with long silent witnesses added to the unease. Locals near the crash site recalled seeing the plane flying erratically, as though the pilot was fighting against controls that weren't responding. Retired officials quietly admitted that Murphy had been under discreet surveillance in the months leading up to his death. Suddenly, what had long been dismissed as rumor began to look like something far more serious. If the findings were true, Murphy's death was no accident. It was an execution. Secrets and surveillance. One of the most chilling revelations came from a whistleblower who finally broke his silence decades later. According to his account, Murphy had stumbled upon sensitive information related to covert Cold War operations. Whether through his Hollywood connections or his post-war advocacy work, he had learned things he was never meant to know. This made him dangerous, not on the battlefield, but in the world of intelligence and power. The whistleblower alleged that Murphy was being monitored, tracked, and perhaps even pressured to remain quiet. His reputation as a national hero only complicated matters. Silencing him would be unthinkable unless it could be disguised as tragedy. The more investigators dug, the clearer the picture became. Murphy wasn't just unlucky, he was targeted. A man who once risked everything for his country may have become the victim of the very forces he once defended. A hero betrayed. The idea was almost too cruel to contemplate. Audie Murphy, who had faced tanks, artillery, and machine guns, may not have fallen to an enemy army, but to betrayal. The boy who carried his family through poverty, the soldier who carried his comrades through battle, the actor who carried Hollywood westerns into theaters. And yet, betrayed he was. Evidence suggested his final flight had been sabotaged. A man who survived the battlefield was eliminated in peacetime, in secret. For decades, America celebrated Murphy as a symbol of courage. Now his story seemed rewritten. A hero betrayed not by foreign enemies, but by shadows within his own nation. What had once been painted as a tragic accident was increasingly viewed as a calculated erasure. It was a wound not only to his family, but to the very legacy of American honor. Family in the shadows. For Murphy's widow, Pamela, and their two sons, the revelations were devastating. For years, they had lived with grief, believing he was simply taken too soon by cruel chance. Now confronted with evidence of foul play, they faced a new pain, the possibility that their husband and father had been murdered. Pamela, who had stood by him through the storms of PTSD, gambling, and restless fame, was forced to revisit every moment of his life through the lens of betrayal. His sons, Terry and James, grew up under the shadow of a legend. Now they also lived under the shadow of a conspiracy. Family members began calling for answers, for transparency, for recognition that their loss was not a simple accident. But against the weight of time and powerful silence, justice seemed elusive. The Murphys were not just mourning anymore. They were demanding the truth. Historians, re-evaluate. The revelations about Murphy's death sent ripples far beyond his family. Historians and military scholars who had long upheld him as the archetype of American heroism were now forced to reconsider the story. What did it mean if one of the country's most celebrated veterans had been silenced? How did this fit into the broader context of Cold War secrecy, intelligence agencies, and Hollywood's uneasy ties with government operations? Murphy's death was no longer just about one man. It became a lens through which to study America itself. Some argued that revisiting the case tarnished his memory. Others insisted it was the opposite, that confronting the truth, however dark, was the only way to honor him. His legacy, they said, could not rest on a lie. In reevaluating Murphy, historians weren't just piecing together the final hours of a war hero. They were also exposing the fragility of trust between a nation and those who serve it. The dark truth. And so the mystery of Audie Murphy's death, long dismissed as a tragic accident, now stands in a different light. Sabotage, surveillance, secrets, betrayal. The boy from Texas who survived hunger, abandonment, and war, who carried an army on his shoulders and stared down death more times than anyone could count, was undone not by fate but by calculated hands. The truth at last is not good. It is bitter, heavy, and haunting. For his family, it is a wound that can never fully heal. For historians, it is a reminder of how power operates in shadows. And for America, it is a tragedy that forces us to ask hard questions. How do we honor our heroes? And how often are they sacrificed not by enemies abroad, but by forces much closer to home? Audie Murphy's mystery may finally be solved, but in solving it, we have uncovered not peace, but a far darker reality. Audie Murphy's life was the story of a hero, but his death is the story of betrayal. The mystery that lingered for decades has been cracked open, and what spills out is far more unsettling than anyone expected. He survived war, but he could not survive what came after. So what do we do with this truth? That's the question left to us, and it is one that refuses to be answered easily.